Deploying software updates. All right, so we've got applications nailed at this point, and we've got operating systems nailed at this point too. The operating systems were sort of challenging, but at this point we can get new OSs deployed out whenever we want. So we kind of have to take, at this point, a little bit of a right turn because we want to talk about software updates. And I must admit that the whole notion of software updates is, well, it's different if we're talking about the software updates that Microsoft releases as opposed to the software updates that pretty much anybody else releases. And one big reason for that is that Microsoft's software updates really, Microsoft has developed this very rich, very fully featured solution called the Windows Server Update Services and the Windows Update Agent. And so this WSS infrastructure that you probably already have, and now the WUA agent that is probably already installed onto all the computers in your environment, allows us to deploy out software updates and Microsoft-specific software updates in a different way than having to package them up as regular applications. And this is a good thing. In fact, Config Manager, as you'll find out here in just a minute, leans on WSS and the Windows Update Agent for, if not most, at least many of its update actions. So you're gonna look at reports, and these reports are going to be Config Manager reports, but the information that essentially populates the report comes from your WSS server. In fact, you can actually leverage your existing WSS infrastructure if you have one in place. A lot of us already do. So if you have a WSS server that's sitting out somewhere, a lot of times it's a virtual machine in your environment, you can actually just kind of create that as a site system, install the software update point role to it, and then leverage that separate solution because it already exists. If you don't, you can use your Config Manager site server as a software update point and as a WSS server as well. If your WSS server is in fact not a Config Manager site server, so if it's not your site server, you will need to have the WSS console installed onto that site server. If you remember way back when we were installing the Config Manager site server, it told us that we needed to have the WSS SDK installed on the site server in order for things to function. And back during that installation nugget, we sort of just glossed over that. In fact, it wasn't installed. We're going to do that here in this nugget. In fact, when we get to the interaction portion, we're going to install WSS 3.0 SP2. Then with that installed, we're going to install the software update point and configure some client agents, what we've normally been doing, and then go through the process of managing and deploying software updates. And also taking a look at those compliance reports. So you have some options here based on what you may already have in play in your environment. Now, one of the new kind of things that's actually very cool in the way Config Manager now deploys updates is this notion of automatic deployment rules. In previous versions of Config Manager, the way in which Config Manager actually deployed updates was a little bit different than the way WSS tended to deploy updates. And with Config Manager, you have a couple of different ways in which you can actually deploy or deal with how you manage those updates. One is very update-centric. So in an environment where you have a heavy requirement for specific baselines, you can determine, I want this, and this update, and push those out via independent packages so you can manage how those updates get deployed. Some people like that. Many of us, however, just really want to say, all right, well, for everything that's a critical update, that's a security update, just install that because I don't really care. So now with this version, you have two different ways in which you can deploy those updates. Either the way that involves very heavy-handed control and very specific deployment, or I can just set up automatic deployment rules and I just really don't care. So, and I'll show you how both of these work because, again, depending on who you are and what your requirements are, well, you may want to choose one versus the other. Now, a Config Manager infrastructure actually, as I said, integrates with a WSS infrastructure. So if I have a Config Manager server here, and I also have a WSS server here, well, there are some interactions that have to go on between that Config Manager server and that WSS server so that we can go about deploying those updates. Obviously, we're going to have one or more clients that are out here, probably more than one, and these clients then need to interact with the WSS server and also with the Config Manager server in order to talk about, well, or to identify when they need to complete those updates. The WSS server in this configuration. The WSS server is really what handles most of the client interaction between deploying updates, inventorying those clients, doing all the work that's required to make sure, well, do I have the right updates, which ones do I need, and then which ones do I deploy? So a lot of this interaction here as it relates to updates actually occurs between the WSS server and the individual clients. The config manager server then leverages that WSS SDK to gather information from the WSS server and ingest that into the config manager database. So your WSS server is going to have a database, your config manager server is going to have a database, and they kind of talk with each other to ensure that config manager and WSS stay essentially synchronized for the data that they need. The reason why this happens is because up here in the config manager server, well, you will ultimately be creating reports that will help you identify what your compliance metrics are. And those reports can come out of the data that essentially get ingested into config manager. Now there's one more piece that comes into play here, and it relates to how WSS ends up getting its updates and the update metadata from Microsoft. So there's another interrelation that has to happen here between the WSS server and the update servers at Microsoft. That's the typical synchronization. If you played with WSS before, you know that WSS will, on a scheduled basis, go ask Microsoft for what updates it needs to download and download those along with the update metadata. So as I said, there are a few actors at play here. The config manager server, where the software updates point actually gets created. The WSS server, which handles sort of the real heavy lifting in this activity. The Microsoft servers, which deploy out the updates when Microsoft releases them. And then this client over here, which has the config manager agent, and the config manager agent takes care of updating the WSS settings on your behalf. So all of these, again, are kind of at play as you go about incorporating WSS into your config manager infrastructure. So here we have our config manager server. This is config MGR1, the server we've been using this entire time. And you'll notice here, if I take a look at software library, we have this software updates node here. This is where all of the work is involved, or is done really, when you're dealing with updates in config manager. But there's really nothing we can do here yet because, well, we don't actually have any software updates. We haven't deployed a WSS server yet, and we have to do that in order to do anything here with configuration manager. So one of the first things we have to do here is not in config manager, but is instead in server manager. Now, in a production environment, again, you would probably have the WSS role installed onto your server before you went about doing config manager. We didn't do that mainly because I just simply wanted to give you the opportunity to see the WSS installation as it relates to configuration manager here. So trying to wrap everything together into a single nugget. If we click next through all of these initial settings here and then install, we're going to go through and install that Windows Server Update Services role. Now the role also installs the WSS client components too, not the client components, the administrative console. And it's that administrative console that config manager really needs to have in order to interact with WSS. So if you have an existing WSS server in your environment, you won't necessarily need to create a new one, but if you just need to install those bits that make up the config manager console onto this config manager, or the WSS console onto this config manager server so that you can get the interaction that you require. You'll notice that when this WSS installation occurs, well, it's actually going to launch the WSS 3.0 SP2 setup wizard here. Now, when this setup wizard actually appears, there are going to be a number of questions that we actually have to answer in order to complete the setup. And a lot of these questions, as you'll notice, need to be answered with fairly out-of-the-box responses, because config manager is going to kind of take over the control of these settings, but it has to have these initial settings in place first. We want to store updates locally in whatever drive makes sense. It probably won't be the C drive for you, but this is a small server, so I'll put it on the C drive. I want to install, in this case, the Windows internal database on this computer, or I could use an existing database if I wanted to. I could use the SQL database that's actually on this computer if I wanted. And I can also either use the existing IIS default website, or I can create a special Windows Server Update Services 3.0 SP2 website. Now I'm going to create this special WSUS 3.0 SP2 website because the existing default IIS website may actually be in use by Configuration Manager. And the only thing that's different here whenever you create that special website is that it actually changes the port that Config Manager uses from TCP 80 to TCP 8530. That's kind of the default port there. You know, honestly, it's generally a good idea to change your WSUS website to an alternative port, because if you think about it, in a situation where you have some sort of active exploit going on that has to do with TCP 80, like a web-based exploit, it's kind of a good idea to have a different port available so that you can patch your systems and validate their patch status that has nothing to do with your typical IIS port. So I generally change this to 8530 just because it's a good idea. You'll have to remember this because we'll need to punch that in here in just a minute. Here is the Are You Ready to Install wizard? And that goes about installing all the bits that are necessary to complete the WSUS installation. So let me pause things for just a minute. When we come back, I will have WSUS ready to go, and we'll continue with installing the Config Manager software update point. And we're back. As you can see, we have the WSUS role that's been installed to the server, Config Manager 1. If you recall, the last time you installed a WSUS server, immediately after the install and before this role installation completes, there's an initial configuration wizard that pops up with WSUS. When that does actually pop up in this circumstance, you want to actually cancel out of that because Config Manager is going to take care of controlling those settings. I actually canceled out of it here so you can't see it, but just be aware that when that does pop up, just cancel right back out of it and bring yourself down here to Server Manager. And the reason for that is because, well, once the installation is done, the next step is installing our software update point here in Config Manager. And that update point kind of handles really managing all of those configurations on your behalf. Here under Administration, I can go to a Site Configuration. I'm going to install the software update point to our server, Config Manager 1. Select Next here and choose the software update point here. Just a couple settings that you need to be aware of. First, whether or not you want to use a proxy server when synchronizing software updates. Okay, the outbound, does this WSUS server need a proxy server in order to go to Microsoft and actually download those software updates? And also, do you need to use a proxy server when downloading content that has auto deployment rules? So as you'll find out here in just a second, when we create those automatic deployment rules, is there also a proxy server that's required? I don't have a proxy server here, so I can skip over here to the active settings. And yes, I do actually want to use this server as the active software update point. So when we do that, you'll notice down here that I have the option of choosing whether I want to use the default website or a custom website. Now, a custom website, as I mentioned earlier, is that special 85 or port 8530 website that we create so that we can separate off the WSUS activities from the regular IIS activities that happen over port 80 and 443. I'm not actually going to create an SSL-based site here across 8531. There actually are some extra steps here that it's just kind of out of scope for this nugget. So we're going to create that custom website here, port 8530. We're going to synchronize our content here from Microsoft Update. Now, if there was an upstream update server, another WSUS server that was upstream from this server, we could actually synchronize from that location as well. Some environments may require you to have a master WSUS server that downloads its content to downstream servers. And if you do, well, you'll want to synchronize from that server and not directly from Microsoft Update. If you're air-gapped from the rest of the internet, and this is the case in certain circumstances, you may not actually be able to synchronize from Microsoft Update. And if that's the case, there actually is a WSUS util command that you'll need for ingesting, for importing in that content and metadata. And again, this is another kind of out of scope for this nugget, but be aware that this configuration can support environments that are actually air-gapped from the internet and air-gapped from Microsoft's servers. Do you want to create or not create WSUS reporting events? There actually is a button down here on the bottom that is for if you do want to create WSUS reporting events. On the next screen, I can choose my synchronization schedule. A lot of times you'll want to decrease this schedule down so that it actually synchronizes more often than just every 7 days. The synchronization activity is not terrifically hard on server resources. So doing it on an everyday basis ensures that you have the most up-to-date content that you can get. And also, do you want to alert when that synchronization fails on any site in the hierarchy? Supersedence rules here determine whether or not you're going to expire superseded updates. Back in the day, updates that superseded other updates became a real nightmare of a problem trying to keep them all straight. And these days, WSUS actually has some far superior tools for helping you eliminate updates that are no longer really relevant because they've been superseded by some newer update. So it's generally a good idea to immediately expire or wait a period of time to expire those updates when a newer update, one that's superseded an older update, actually gets released from Microsoft, because this actually happens quite often. What classifications do you care about? Security updates, service packs, update roll-ups. I'm going to kind of limit things down to just security updates here, just to keep the size of the database relatively small. And then also, what products do you care about? Here's where you can do a few things wrong. And if you select all products, it's going to download an inordinate amount of content to your server. Very, very large amount. So if you have those products, obviously you do want to keep them updated. But if you don't have those products, it's generally a much better idea for you to go through and identify which products actually are important for you to keep updated in your infrastructure. Notice here Office is selected by default. And also down here is Windows. Even for Windows, we can select which versions of Windows we actually care about. I don't care about 2003. I don't care about Windows Server 2008 anymore. I'm on 2008 R2 and Windows 7. Also don't care about Windows Vista or Windows XP in this case. So I can reduce the size of my database by just simply selecting which versions I actually have in my environment that I want to care about. So I'm going to select those down, and also which languages I want as well. Another very important caution here is not to download the languages that you're not actually using in your environment. Because just like with the products, additional languages can actually increase fairly dramatically the size of that content that you have to download from Microsoft. So if you don't care about Russian and Japanese and French, well, you can download yourself just to whatever language makes sense for your environment. My environment here is English. That's the language I've been using here for as long as I can remember. So let's choose English here as just simply the language for both the update file and the summary details, the metadata. When we're done, we choose Next, and then Finish here to complete actually creating this software update point. So here in just a second or so, this will show that Config Manager 1 now has an additional count of roles here for that software update point number 14. So that actually is what we need to do here for updating the software update point. Once we have that installed, there actually are a very small number of client settings as well that will instruct all the clients what they should do in relation to software updates. Now, we skipped over them earlier. They're down here under software updates right here. And these software update client settings, as I said, define, well, all right, how should the clients behave in relation to deploying software updates. I can change the scan schedule, and also for deployment reevaluation. Again, decreasing these to a smaller number of days is generally a good idea if you want to ensure that your update compliance percentages go to 100% as fast as possible. You can also choose to, when a software update deployment deadline is reached, install the other deployments with an upcoming deadline if you want. And then what period of time for pending deployments do you want to install those? With a lot of these, it's just a great idea to deploy out these updates and get them out as fast as possible. That's really the kind of the point here with software updates. So reducing these timeouts down to a much more manageable value ensures that, well, if a machine happens to be off the network, it's not going to have to wait for 7 days to get another update. You want to get these updates deployed out as fast as you possibly can, generally. So I'm going to click OK here, and that actually sets those default client settings. Our next step in the process is, well, to wait, honestly. The process of synchronizing the WSUS server out to Microsoft can actually take a pretty extended period of time. In fact, you can actually verify how the success of this process is going. If you take a look over here at monitoring and scroll down here to the software update point synchronization status, it'll show you here that for Config Manager 1, well, it looks like we are currently in the process of synchronizing the WSUS server with Microsoft. If we have any kind of error code here, then we know that something's gone wrong. And you can actually look up those error codes online to see what they correspond with. Maybe you're having a proxy problem, or maybe you've got some sort of database corruption problem. But generally, this is how we go about actually synchronizing that WSUS server. You can actually kick off an out-of-cycle WSUS synchronization if you want, up here under Software Library. And if I go here and I choose one of the software updates nodes, you'll see I can choose to synchronize software updates. And if I choose yes here, it will actually go about synchronizing a site-wide, a lot of S's, very hard to say, synchronizing a site-wide communication of software updates. And if you don't want to wait for that next 24-hour period to occur, well, this will actually go through the process. Let's go ahead and run that. Well, I've actually already run that now, so we'll let that run. And in fact, I'm going to pause things for just a minute so that I can actually get some of these software updates to appear here in this list. And when they do, we can take a look at what software updates are available and how we'll go about actually deploying those updates to the different clients in our infrastructure. And we're back. So that was about, gosh, what was that? About 30 minutes or so, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. Between when I hit pause and when I hit unpause, between the last step and now in this step. You can see that we now have a number of updates here that are listed as required. You should be familiar, if you played with WSUS before, with the whole notion of required. Now, in the Windows Update agent architecture, right, the agent asserts back to the server what updates that it sees as it needing. And so the Windows Update server, the WSUS server, can identify, okay, well, where are updates actually needed by different agents or different clients based off of what they say that they require. And so in this case, I have that Windows 7 computer, Client 1, that we've been working with throughout this series, that doesn't have very many updates installed to it. And so consequently, you can see that a number of these updates, MS-12, 09, 05, 013, these all show as being required for that specific, so for that update. Now, in order to get here, as I mentioned, it took about 20 to 30 minutes. And part of that is, back to the whole SMS meaning slow-moving software, but more importantly, what it means is that there are a number of activities that actually have to occur before you can even begin to see some of this data. So if you don't see the data right away, don't worry, because it just takes a period of time for these things to occur. Now, you can speed up this process by doing a couple of things. First of all, down here under monitoring, this software update point synchronization status. This will tell you what the status of the update from Microsoft. So downloading all the updates from Microsoft and synchronizing your local computer with Microsoft's computers. This actually takes two steps. It has to download catalog version 0, and then it has to download catalog version 1, which includes all of the updates that you've told it that it needs. So it actually has to kind of go through two of these updates for it to successfully complete. Once that catalog is updated, well, back here under Software Library, and the way you synchronize the catalog is up here with synchronized software updates. Once the catalog is updated, then the clients then need to verify their status against the metadata that's built into the catalog. Okay, so this is step 2. Now you can speed that process up here by, on any of the clients in your test environment, going to the Configuration Manager control panel. And there are going to be 3 different actions that you'll want to enact in order to kind of speed things up. The first is a machine policy retrieval and evaluation cycle. And then the second 2 are the deployment evaluation cycle and the scan cycle. It's really the scan cycle that you're most interested in at this point. So first step is to sync from Microsoft. Second step is to sync from your clients so you can verify you actually have good client data. Then the third step is to actually run a summarization on that data after it's been uploaded from the clients. So you have to wait a little bit for the synchronization to complete from Microsoft, and then you have to invoke it over the client side. Then you have to run this synchronization to actually take all the data that has been collected and then turn it into usable product that you can use here in the Software Updates node. And you'll go through that a couple of times before you'll actually start to get some of the information back out of the clients. In fact, there are a number of updates that are actually installed to those clients, as you can see right here. So MS11-051 currently installed on one machine, not required on a second machine, as you can see down here at the bottom. So this gives you an idea for essentially why you're waiting in certain circumstances for a lot of these updates to actually come in. Another option for you is to install all this stuff and just wait overnight, because by the next morning all of these activities will have occurred. Now the way that you go about actually gathering all these updates together can be done in one of two different methods. And I mentioned that earlier versions of Config Manager really only had one kind of method, and that's where you really focused on the updates themselves. This is great if you are really concerned about ensuring a certain baseline for different computers. Back in the day, I used to work doing Configuration Manager for a software development environment. And in that software development environment, we wanted to make sure we knew exactly which updates were on the machines at all times so that we could validate that against the tests that we were running for that piece of software. Now, many of us don't really care about that level of control. So for those of us that don't care, well, we have these automatic deployment rules which kind of make things a little bit easier. These weren't really around in earlier versions of SMS and Config Manager, so they made things, it was a bit challenging before we actually had these automatic deployment rules. Let me show you both ways in which you can actually deploy updates. The first way is simply to figure out which updates you want. Let's assume that I have these required updates here, and I'm going to scroll down so I catch all the required ones. In fact, there seem to be quite a few. And I'm going to use the Shift key here to actually select all the ones that I want. What I'm going to do is actually right-click to create an update group. Now this update group, we'll call it My Update Group, contains all of those updates. Okay, so this update group is essentially a group of all of these updates that I will then later use for deploying out to the different clients in my environment. You'll see here's my update group, and I can take a look at the members if I want of that update group, which is, again, everything that I just selected there. And this update group becomes the entity that you will ultimately deploy down to the different clients in your environment. So if I choose deploy here, well, that's going to go ahead and start the deploy software updates wizard, which initiates this deployment of these updates out to the different clients in my environment. The deploy updates wizard, kind of similar to what you're used to whenever you're creating advertisements or applications. I have to choose a collection here. I'll choose the all systems collection just to make things easy. I've got some deployment settings here. Is this a required deployment, or am I just making these updates available for users? A lot of times we make update deployments required because, well, we want them on systems. Do I want to use Wake on LAN? Be aware that actually the Wake on LAN settings in Windows 7 SP1 have improved significantly. Back in previous versions, Wake on LAN could actually wake up machines, and then the machines would take a fairly long amount of time for them to power back down based off of what their hibernation settings were. And this could be a bad problem, actually, if you had, for example, a laptop that was stuck in somebody's laptop case in a hotel room somewhere. Because that laptop was in the laptop case, well, you could wake it up and it would install the updates, but then it would be sitting around for however many hours your hibernation settings are set for, which in some cases could melt down those laptops. These days, the Wake on LAN for WSUS configuration is set to wake them up, install them, and power them back down very quickly. So you shouldn't have to worry too much about melting down laptops by selecting this like you would in the old days. I can also choose what level of detail I want for my status messages, normal or minimal. When do I want to schedule the evaluation? Okay, based on client time, as soon as possible. Do I want to set a deadline, for example, of as soon as possible, or further down will be a specific deadline that I can select? Do I want the users to actually see the updates being deployed? Depending on your environment, you may want those user balloons to show up, or whether you want to deploy that actually in Software Center, so that the users could download that in an off-cycle period. These are, again, depending on how much interaction you want with your users. Do you want, when the installation deadline is reached, do you want these activities to be performed outside the maintenance window? A lot of times you will. Do you want to prevent restarts from occurring on servers, for example, instead of workstations? So this can allow you to deploy the updates out to your servers, but delay the restart so you can do the restart at some time that's much more appropriate for you. You can set up alerts, configuration manager alerts, and operations manager alerts if you want. Same sort of download settings as what we had with applications. If I'm in a slow boundary or if I can't actually download the content from my preferred distribution points, what do I want to do? Also, do I want clients to share that content with other clients on the same subnet? If I've got clients out at a very latent subnet, do I want to allow them to use the branch cache functionality? Here to next, I then need to create a new deployment package. So let's just call this my deployment package, and I'll call this the manual one, because really I've kind of manually created this list of updates that I'm going to deploy, rather than having some automatic solution doing it for me. When I do that, I then need to create the package in some location, and we've created this under the config manager server, the source files location. And I have security updates here. Let me go ahead and create a new folder called manual and drop this package in that manual folder. Okay, it's just like with applications, I have to have that kind of working folder there in the source files location for where the updates will get downloaded to before they get moved to the distribution points. What distribution points do I want to add this content to once it's been downloaded? And again, that's configmanager1.company.pri. Where do I want to download these software updates from? Either from the internet or from a location on the network. For example, if you have an air-gapped network that you've brought in those updates from somewhere else. Which languages do we want to select? In our case, it's English, and then the summary. So what this does is it creates essentially an advertisement and a package, to use old language, for this update deployment. And then when we go about actually deploying it to in fact, we've done that here to the all systems collection, when we create this package, it will begin deploying out to the different users in the environment. As you can see here, it's going through kind of downloading the updates and creating that package, so it's going to take a second or two to actually complete this process. Now once it completes, if we choose close here, you'll see that we have the software update group, the one that we created, and we also have the deployment package that we created with a package ID associated. So this package has now been downloaded, and the updates that we've selected have essentially been collected into this package. And you'll notice over here on the right now that for each update, the updates have shown to be, or they're now shown to be downloaded and deployed. So you now, in this environment, are going to deploy out this package with the settings that we set. Now, that said, right, this whole process of having to click through all of these individual updates and figure out what they are and try to figure out if I care about them and what their properties are, and setting maximum run time and any custom severity and any content information here, this can be a big challenge, especially in environments where you just don't care. You just want updates to deploy. You just want to know that you're secure, but you're not really terrifically concerned with the status of any one particular update. You just want to know that the right updates are installed so that you're at the best level of the best security posture that you can. So if this level of granular control is something that's not of interest to you, well, then we have this notion of automatic deployment rules. And these really simplify a lot of the processes of dealing with updates in Configuration Manager. A lot of people back in previous versions just really, they really didn't like the way Config Manager wrapped around WSS because the two didn't really follow the same philosophy. So in an automatic deployment rule, let's call this my deployment rule, and this is an automatic one. What we're going to do here is actually, just like before, targeting it to a collection, but we're going to create a new software update group, turn on WakeOn LAN, automatically deploy all software updates found by this rule, approve any license agreements if they exist, and then here in this location, identify what the search filters are for the updates that we want to deploy. Now, I can deploy it by article ID if I want. Or I can deploy it by, I don't know, who the vendor is. But for most of us, what we're looking for here is perhaps items that are of a critical severity and or items that, for example, are required. If I set required to 1, well, that's essentially equivalent to give me all the updates that are required. If I want also, I can choose to, down here, identify the ones that are not superseded, and then also highlight which products I'm interested in. So maybe I'm just merely interested in the Windows 7 content down here. So what this does is it allows me to create, just like with a collection, kind of a query-based format for whatever updates I'm interested in, so that I can deploy those updates out and it can evaluate the contents of that package whenever it needs to. So I need to specify a schedule to run this rule. I can update this so it's not done every 30 days, but instead every day. That identifies when we actually gather all these things together. And then also when I want to do the deployment schedule. Okay, is this as soon as possible? Is my installation deadline as soon as possible? Or do I want to set specific times? The notion here, as I said, is that I want to create an environment where I can set up this one automatic deployment rule, and it just works. And every time there's new updates, it will eventually gather those updates and repackage them into a package. And those updates will then get deployed via whatever the next cycle is for deploying them out. Same sort of config manager and ops manager alerts, same deployment settings. Do I want to create now a new deployment package? So instead of the manual one, so my deployment package here, I'm going to create an automatic one. With the package source here being back in that source files location for security updates, and in the subfolder here now called automated. There. Set it to distribution points just like before, using config manager 1 as the appropriate distribution points. Download the updates from the internet, set the right languages, configure the summary, and then ultimately we have that deployment rule. So this gives you the ability to, again, kind of take a little bit of the scut work out of updates deployment and really bring it into an automation that just delivers out whatever you're looking for. You will need to, from time to time, you can wait for this rule to go about doing whatever it needs based on the schedule that you've deployed, or you can select for it to run now. So this will identify the software updates that that follow the filter that we configured for this rule, and then create everything so that it can create the deployment package and get that deployment package ultimately delivered out. Over here under deployment packages, you'll see now that we have an automatic deployment package and also this manual deployment package. So two different, very different mechanisms that you can use for actually deploying out updates in your environment. There's one last thing that we want to take a look at here, and just very quickly under reporting, I want to take a look at a few of the software updates reports that exist. So 5 different software updates kind of categories of reports. Compliance, we've got management over here, we've got states, we have scan, and the last one down here is troubleshooting. But what these do is give you a feeling for what your compliance is, and perhaps why you might not be getting the level of compliance that you're looking for. So for the update group that I'm concerned about here, I can select the all systems collection. I'm not sure if I'm going to get data out of this just yet. But actually, here we go. All systems for clients with compliance state unknown, because we haven't really run this group yet. But what this does is it gives you that overall description and really that overall feeling for how well you are succeeding with your update deployment. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've really talked about the whole process of deploying software updates and all the kind of interesting ways in which Config Manager in this version can deploy out those updates based on what your requirements are. We talked about how Config Manager actually leans on the Windows Update agent and also WSS for a lot of the different update actions that exist out there. If I can actually get this pen to work. So Config Manager, kind of a wrapper around WSS and around the Windows Update agent. Talked about how you can leverage your existing WSS infrastructure and kind of the things that you have to have in place if you already have an existing WSS server out there. We installed WSS 3.0 SP2 in that software update point. We configured some client settings, and then we went through all the tasks that are necessary to manage, collect, and deploy software updates out to the different things in your environment. Coming up next, we are going to shift once again from software updates and start talking about some of these compliance settings. So now that we have operating systems that we've deployed, and we have applications now on top of those operating systems, and we also have the updates that are keeping those operating systems in check. Well, now we might want to actually identify different settings that we want to configure on those OSs to ensure that our users have the right experience. And that's what we can do with compliance settings, which is coming up in that next nugget. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.